Zenithal Priming. Is it really all black and white? We're going on that journey. Zenithal priming isn't something you see very much on my channel. I don't find there's a lot of use for it outside of taking a picture of your model as a reference for where the lights might hit it. But I feel like when it comes to getting lots of stuff done pretty quickly, it can actually have a huge impact on that base layer. But with that comes a caveat. I don't think black is the right base color. In fact, I think in order to do Zenithal, all you really need is one can of white primer. So it's time to experiment. I have 4 Battle Brothers, and each of them I'm going to do in different base colors and techniques for getting them on, then finish them off in some of the major chapters colors for Space Marines. First model in this experiment will be a Blood Angel. For the base coat, I'll actually be using a green, almost like a Dark Angel's. I'll be applying the green as an ink, and I'll be applying it with just a brush. The highlight will be red paint with some thinners and applied by airbrush. I'll be using my scale 75 inks for this, but I'm almost 99% sure they're just an acrylic ink in a dropper bottle. So any acrylic ink would work, and you can usually find inks at every art store. Just make sure it's an acrylic and not alcohol based. Or maybe you can. I've never used alcohol based, so I can't say for sure how it'd work on a model. When I started, I thought the green tone of the ink was actually too bright over the white. They're dark in the pots, but they reveal their true selves over white. So I added some black ink just to darken it a bit and give me the right tone. As I paint this on, the pros of ink were that it kind of pools a bit in the deep recesses and makes it much darker, which is exactly what we want for a Zenithal base coat. It also went on generally smooth and easy. Because ink stains, once it hits the matte white, that white is forever not white anymore. With a second coat, I also believe it would be a bit darker as well. The cons, however, are 2. Number 1 was that as I did a heavy wash, some of the bubbles would get into the recesses and then pop, leaving the parts white, which means before moving on, I had to go on a treasure hunt and fill in all the X's. Second is that ink is shiny, so the more coats you do, the more glossy it will become, which means for the highlight layer, I might end up with some beading, but I think it'll be minimal here. For the Imperial Fists, my first layer is going to be Wildwood Contrast Paint. I'm going to be applying it by brush. This may be the first and last time I use a contrast paint the way they're intended to be used. For the highlight, I'll be doing a yellow ink applied by brush as well. So this model is fully brush only. So I was gonna start by putting some wildwood on my palette, then remembered my lessons from my last adventure. Closed that up and just used the pot, but out of the way so as not to spill. So I really like the idea of contrast, and I really want to find out ways to use it in everyday painting. However, the standard advertised way is not one of them. I generally didn't like the look of the finished product shown, but for this, as it won't be the final product, I think it'll actually work really well. The pros I found for the contrast are that you can really be thick and sloppy with it. It's been thinned down to the right consistency right out of the pot, so it's good for just quickly dipping and painting. It's also not shy about having huge brushfuls of it just slapped on the model either. It covers well and quickly, and because of the amounts used, gets in all the crevices. The cons, however, is it actually dries pretty quickly in the thin parts, so I feel like you want to be moving as fast as you can so you don't end up with tearing and the bad kind of texture, the lumpy kind. Also, it feels weird going on, kind of like gummy almost, which is just a textural thing I didn't like, but doesn't really matter. And lastly, when it dries, it can be splotchy, which is why I don't like the standard contrast method, but in this case, it won't matter much. For the Ultramarine, I'm going to be starting with a Wildwood contrast again, but this time it'll be applied by airbrush. This will be the only version of this that would require an airbrush, as all the other methods are either brushed on or you'd be able to find a spray can of the paint color used. For the highlights, I'll be using a mix of paint and ink brushed on. To prep the airbrush, I use some water and thinner before adding the contrast. Because the contrast is pretty thin, and this is a base coat, I add a couple brushfuls. This is where I think contrast has the most potential. It goes through an airbrush very smoothly, and because it stains a little bit like inks, it applies very easily as well. But because it has some transparency, you can layer it with an airbrush, making multiple passes darker and darker so you can layer in the shadows. I feel like some of the other colors would work as a highlight coat as well, but this is the only color available to me, and I don't know of any brown Space Marine chapters that are popular. So for this experiment, it's just going to be a base for a couple of them. For the Dark Angels, I'm actually going to be starting with a dark blue base, and I'm going to be applying it via my airbrush. But in essence, I'm pretending that this could be a colored paint from a rattle can in a navy blue. For the highlighting, I'm thinking we can try a thinner version of the overall solutions, a green wash, from either Army Painter or GW. So this one will most resemble a normal Zenithal Priming, but instead of a black primer first, it would be a colored primer. I like dark blue because I think it will make the deep greens nice and dark like Dark Angels like. Because I have to thin this for the airbrush, it does go on pretty light to begin with. So this is one of those ones where I have to do a couple passes to get it right. But in reality, if you're just using a spray, it'd only take one, and you wouldn't need the first layer of white in the first place. You'd just use the blue as the primer. Because of the thinner and the amount of layers I'm adding to this guy, mine's going to come out a little satin. But if I was looking for a colored primer, I'd want to make sure it was on the matte side, as I just think paint goes better over matte surfaces. And that is all the base coats completed. While right now the Blood Angel looks like a Dark Angel and the Dark Angel looks like an Ultramarine, the color choices are important. Green as a base for red should mix with a transparent red over top of it and leave a darker shade of red, while the blue for the green will darken the green but not actually make it too dark or almost black. For the Ultramarine, I was thinking about doing a purple, but the brown should darken the blue without making it look too dark, and yellow over brown is a good way to get contrast between the dark and light yellow without losing any saturation. That's the theories anyway. I'll discuss which method I like the best and for what reasons at the end of the experiment. For my Zenithal highlight, once again, I'm going to be simulating a rattle can with my airbrush. Just a white primer, shot down at the models in a wide spray at a 45-degree angle. One of the questions I see a lot is others wondering if it's possible to do this and not get the speckling. I have two answers for that. One of them is that white on black is 100% contrast. That's why the speckling is far more apparent than layers of color from an airbrush. Both have speckling, but white on black is just more visible. Because we're going over color, it might not be as pronounced in the final result this time. Two is that the can or airbrush is just pushing paint out fast. It doesn't aerosol into a fine mist. So for a spray primer, it's just something that's gonna happen. But with an airbrush, you can thin out the white more, lower the pressure, and do multiple coats, which should give less speckling. Also, don't be silly like me and wear some gloves when doing this. I just forgot mine. I'm being very inaccurate here, and I'm just trying to get the full model covered from 45 degrees. But if you use an airbrush for Zenithal, you can be much more accurate and specific with it, leaving places like the lower legs and the lower parts of the shoulder pads a little darker. It will take more time per model, but should be worth it. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. You can't get more red than red. So this method is perfect for Blood Angels because you can't get more red than when red goes on white. I think my green could have been a bit darker, and maybe I'd have done a few more layers of the ink. Or if I was doing this with just primers, started with a base of Dark Angels green before the white again. But I'm using the airbrush here in the theory that red is transparent even if it comes out of a can. If you're light enough with it, you should be able to do this with all spray cans if you wanted a really quick army. But let's see how it does with the light ink in the finale. As for now, I'm spraying it just all over, since the theory is that red covering the green should show up as darker. I just want to make sure this is as even as a coat as possible. The red over the green for the Blood Angels worked exactly as I expected. It did leave it darker, but still red in the shadows. He still looks a little flat here though, and I think that's my fault. Red plays so nicely with white that I think I went too overboard with the white and it resulted in a flat look. So to prove my point, I did another one. just a throwaway fail print to prove that this works for red, and so on a darker base of green, went lighter on the white, and then an even coat of the red. You can see, especially in the shoulder pad, that you can get an amazing transition from a pure red to a dark red with just 3 layers, but it will take a bit of practice to get the amounts right. For the Dark Angel, I'm going to be splitting the model into 4 areas, because I have 2 brands of washes, GW and Army Painter, and 2 methods of application, brush and airbrush. I want to get them all tested, but on one model. So the legs are going to be brushed and the top is airbrushed. Right side of the model, when facing us, will be Army Painter, and the left will be GW Wash. So to start, I'm brushing GW on the left facing leg. Now some Army Painter green shade on the right. Immediately I could tell the difference in color, but as far as application goes, it feels pretty much the same. I add a large amount to the model at first, then use my brush to spread it out and even it up some, though they both still naturally pool in the recesses. For the airbrush method, I'm barely thinning them, just a drop of water, to give them the best shot. Starting again with GW on the left facing us, the BL Tan green seemed almost darker at first when it started spraying out, but it did go on nice and even where it did build up a bit. That's because it's a very transparent wash. It also sprayed with no problem. The green shade from Army Painter again went on a bit darker tone of green, but it felt like it needed more layers of it to really get it to colorize the white primer. It may have been I added too much water, but even then I still feel like I might have needed to do a few layers of it to really tone down the white into a Dark Angel's territory. So kind of like the Blood Angel, it might have been better to go lighter on the white in the Zenithal, but also pick a lighter blue for the base color. You can see along the arm and a few of the curves of the legs that the transition from green to blue really works as a shade color, but the transparency of the washes means you need a lot to make it truly Dark Angel's green. I think this is very easy though, and with a bit of finesse and practice, the right blue and a softer white Zenithal, or a specifically angled one, this would be the easiest method to start with and get a good result, painted or airbrushed. I'm going to split this model just in half. I only have 1 yellow ink, and that's scale 75s, but I want to try it brush and airbrush. So left facing us is going to be brushed on, and right facing us will be the airbrush. Starting with the brushing, I do add some water to the ink, just because I know it's going to be very saturated. I also wipe it off on a bit of paper towel, because I don't want to apply this like a wash. Ink's power is in its staining ability. So you don't need much, and you can see it literally turning the white into a yellow because it's staining those pigments. It's about adding color, not covering up, and so far I feel like I've gotten it pretty even with just a brush. For airbrush, I add the water of course, but ink is so thin it shouldn't need much flow improvement. It goes on just as easily as the brush version did, and pretty much the same color, just a little bit smoother, but that's expected of the airbrush. Since yellow is opaque, I think this would work just as easily with paint or other wash style paints. Since it dried quickly, I decided to do a second coat as well, just to really pump up that saturation, and since I did it for one side, I wanted to make sure it worked on the other. And it does, so either method here I think you're gonna get pretty negligible differences. I think the problem with ink in this case isn't that it didn't do its job, it's just so good at its job that it's not the right choice. It stained everything, which meant that all of the speckling is still very blatantly obvious because there was no smoothing out with other pigments. You get the exact look you had with the white, just colored yellow instead. This is one of those ones I really wanted to use the contrast with. I think if you had a golden yellow contrast paint put on thinly and evenly with strategically placed white Zenithal, you'd have a very, very good looking transition quite swiftly, and you'd impress everyone with how well you paint yellow, unbeknownst to them that you really just used a rattle can to do it. For the ultramarine, it's time to combine some of our sources. I'll also be splitting this one in half, left facing us for brush, right for airbrush. But the blue I'm going to be using is an ultramarine blue, mixed with ink. This way, I get some pigments to blend between the Zenithal coats, but I also get the staining power of the ink intertwined with the paint to make the transparency. but not lose any color. That's the theory anyway. Going over it with a brush is actually pretty easy. I started off being light with it, but after a bit I felt I could add more to the brush and pull it around. Letting it pool a bit didn't seem like it was going to be a problem. For the airbrush side of things, it actually seemed to go on thinner than the brush method. It was a bit more even, but I actually had to go over a few more surfaces a few times in order to get the right coverage as the other side. The combo of ink and paint is actually how I do a lot of my airbrush work, not just with Zenithal, but just to change the tone of other colors or shade areas in different tones as well. Oddly enough though, when it comes to Zenithal, I actually really like the look of the brushed on one. This color specifically has enough transparency that the pooling you get in some places only helps define those shapes more, but either way, it fades out those transitions nicely. So overall, what would be my winner? Well, for speed, that would go to the Blood Angels and Rattle Cans. When done right, anyway. One base coat, a quick spray of white, and then another spray of red all over, and I think with just a few details, you'd have a very good looking army fast. For ease, that's going to the washes on the Dark Angels. There's really no way to mess it up with the washes because they're so transparent. If it's not right the first time, just add another layer and it will be. And you'd get all the rivets done at the same time. For style, I'm giving it to the ink and paint demonstrated by the Ultramarine. The transition between the white and undershade gets smoothed out by the addition of more pigment, and the ink makes sure everything's brought up to the right tone evenly. Regardless of whichever method you think is best though, I've got one warning for all of them. Go sparingly with the white. We're told an overall spray from 45-degree angle is how you do it, but I think it's so much more practical to actually find a light source and spray in circles going outward from it if using a rattle can, and just picking out the details yourself with an airbrush if you're going that way. There was one competitor missing from this fight, and that's either GW's Contrast or Scale 75's Instant Color. They're kind of the same thing, as a top coat. I think if used sparingly and carefully, they can actually be really, really good. But that's going to be an adventure for you. And if you do try it out, I want you to let me know how it goes, because we're all in this journey together.